Good morning. My name is Irene Beckett. I am here on behalf of the Law Day Committee for the Richmond County Bar Association, and today we are honored to be speaking with Judge Barbara Panepinto. Judge Panepinto actually was the first Staten Island woman elected to the bench in November of 1996. She has been a justice since that time. She has served on numerous committees and is involved with numerous organizations, including the Richmond County Bar Association, the Staten Island Women's Bar Association, Colombian Lawyers, and Brooklyn Women's Bar Association. But even prior to Judge Panepinto becoming a judge, and I learned this through the course of this interview, she had a whole different life. She was a teacher, a mental health worker, a probation officer, and holds a license as a registered nurse. She's truly a model, a role model for a lot of women in the profession, and we are very honored to be here with her. And I'm going to now just turn it over to Judge Panepinto. Welcome to Law Day, Judge.
Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Hello, I am Judge Barbara Panepinto, a New York State Supreme Court judge presiding on cases here in Staten Island. Our courthouses are in St. George, and of course, we're not able to be there today for our annual Law Day celebration. On Law Day, we welcome students from Staten Island to our courthouse to help us celebrate. It is always our pleasure to see you there and to hear your thoughts about the Law Day theme in your own words at our yearly ceremony. We miss being with you dearly. Hopefully, we will all be together again next year. On behalf of our administrative judge, Justice Desmond Green, the president of the Richmond County Bar Association, Jay Duskin, the co-chairpersons of the Richmond County Bar Association Law Day Committee, Michael Gervasi and Pete Wyman, and lastly, but certainly not least, for her technical expertise in putting together this virtual celebration for us today and for you to enjoy, Irene Beckett, a member of the Law Day Committee and a member of the Surrogates Court legal team. Law Day, celebrated annually, usually on May 1st, was created by an act of Congress in 1958 as a national day set aside to celebrate the rule of law, our Constitution, and the many freedoms given to us by it as Americans. Law Day provides an opportunity to understand how the law and the legal process protect our liberty, strive to achieve justice, and contribute to the freedoms that all Americans share. Each year, the American Bar Association selects a theme for Law Day around the country. This year's theme, Your Vote, Your Voice, Our Democracy, the 19th Amendment at 100, invites us to reflect on the historic contributions of the pioneering suffragettes, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who started a movement for equality and justice, which began right here in our own state of New York with the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, which 70 years later ultimately led to the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in 1920. That is 100 years ago this year. While the pioneers of women's suffrage would certainly be pleased with the progress of women in American society, including the record number of women, today 131, serving in the current Congress in Washington, and in our own New York State judiciary, where women now make up 42% of the judges sitting in the courts in the state of New York. I am proud to say that I was the very first woman elected here on Staten Island to serve the people of Staten Island as a judge in 1996. But those pioneers who fought so long and hard for the right of women to vote would be surprised and even disappointed at the public's woeful lack of civil knowledge, and even more frightening, at the low voter turnout we experience year after year across our nation and in our own state and city, and right here in our community of Staten Island, where virtually less than 25% of the people who are eligible to vote in any election. And some years it's even less than that. We have been fortunate in Staten Island to have our Law Day hosted each year by the Richmond County Bar Association, who have again planned a joint event designed to harness the power of the legal profession to work with educators on strengthening civil knowledge and engagement among our young people. Albeit different than years before, since the COVID-19 emergency has forced us to postpone this event. But I assure you, it is as important as ever for our program to have lawyers and judges collaborating with our local educators in Staten Island from the various high schools and even grammar schools that have joined with us this year to engage our students on civics and improve their understanding of the courts, the justice system, the rule of law, and most importantly, as soon to be future voters, of the power that we have as voters to guide our own destiny in our own community of Staten Island by voting here on Staten Island to bring the power of the people to the choices you make on Staten Island, as well as those choices for our city, the state of New York, and for our country. As members of the bar, we each swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. We understand well that we are the guardians of our own democracy and that it is up to us to lead the way. As our Chief Judge of the State of New York, Janet D. Fiore, reminded us on May 1st by video, that our obligation is to preserve and defend our cherished right to vote. And by working collaboratively with the Bar Association, as well as our justice partners, we may endeavor to do that. And while this may be a law day unlike any other in our history, our constitutional mission, is unchanged. It is now more important than ever that we continue to provide access to justice, to the courts, and to uphold the rule of law for the benefit of every American. This year's theme, Women's Suffrage, is the right of women to vote. Beginning in the mid-19th century, that is during the 1800s, aside from the work being done by women for economic and political equity and for social reforms, women sought to change voting laws to allow women to vote. Extended political campaigns and marches by women and their supporters have always been necessary to pass legislation or constitutional amendments to allow women to vote. National and international organizations were formed to coordinate efforts towards that objective. In ancient Athens, often cited as the birthplace of democracy, only adult male citizens who own land were permitted to vote. In the Constitution, when the United States first came to be, it was only male white property owners who were allowed to vote. That left not only women, but also Native Americans and people of color, who were mostly slaves at that time, unable to vote. Previously, in 1756, a woman named Lydia Taft had become the first legal woman voter in colonial America. But that occurred under British rule in the Massachusetts colony, where she was allowed to vote at New England town meetings. Some unmarried white women who owned property were allowed to vote for a brief period of time in New Jersey, but from 1776 to 1807 only. So the demand for women's suffrage, the right of women to vote, began to gather strength in the 1840s, and it emerged from the broader movement of women's rights for economic and social equality. The seed for a women's rights convention in the United States was planted in 1840 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. The conference refused to allow Mott and other women delegates from the United States in because they were women. These Quaker women were committed to the anti-slavery movement in the United States, as well as the movement for women's rights and economic and social equality. Thereafter, the women decided to hold their own convention for women's rights in the United States. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention, was held right here in New York and passed a resolution in favor of women's suffrage, despite opposition from some of its own organizers who believed that the idea of women voting was too extreme. The first women's rights convention that was held in July 1848 in Seneca Falls was in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. 5 women called the convention to order, 4 of whom were Quaker social activists, including the well-known Lucretia Mott. The 5th was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had discussed the need to organize for women's rights with Mott earlier after that London debacle. Stanton, who came from a family that was deeply involved in politics, became a major force in convincing the women's movement that political pressure was crucial to its goals and that the right to vote was a key weapon, but not everyone there at the convention agreed. An estimated 300 women and men attended this 2-day event, which was widely noted in the press. The only resolution that was not adopted unanimously by the convention was the one demanding the women's right to vote. That only passed by a majority. Lucretia Mott, the main speaker, was also disturbed by that very proposal. The resolution was adopted only after Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist leader and former slave, gave his strong support to it. The convention's Declaration of Sentiments, which was written primarily by Stanton, expressed an intent to build a women's rights movement, and it included a list of grievances, and in addition to women's suffrage, included government reform and changes in male roles and behaviors that had promoted inequality for women. The Seneca Falls resolutions began a 70-year struggle by women to secure the right to vote. Equal rights became the rallying cry of the early movement for women's rights, and equal rights meant claiming access to all. That is the prevailing definition of freedom. Susan B. Anthony, the woman who later became celebrated for women's suffrage, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met in 1850, became close friends and co-workers. Their decades-long collaboration was pivotal for the suffrage movement and contributed significantly to the broader struggle for women's rights, which Stanton called the greatest revolution the world has ever known. Together, they developed a sophisticated movement in New York State, but their work at this time dealt with women's issues in general, not specifically suffrage. Anthony, who eventually became the person most closely associated in the public mind with women's suffrage, and whose image is on the $1 coin minted in 1979, later said, "I wasn't ready to vote, I didn't want to vote, but I did want equal pay for equal work, economic reform." Before the Civil War, Anthony gave priority to anti-slavery work, over her work for the women's movement. The anti-slavery movement and the women's movement were joined at the very beginning. These two women would be joined in the long struggle to secure the vote for women in the United States. In 1868, Anthony encouraged working women from the printing and sewing trades in New York, who were excluded from men's trade unions, to form working women's associations. As a delegate to the National Labor Congress in 1868, Anthony persuaded the Committee on Female Labor to call for votes for women and equal pay for equal work. The long existing collaboration between the abolitionist anti-slavery movement and the women's suffrage movement parted ways. The immediate cause for the split was the proposed 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which was passed in 1870. This was a post-Civil War Reconstruction Amendment that prohibited denying the right to vote because of race. Staten and Anthony opposed its passage unless it was accompanied by another amendment that would prohibit the denial of suffrage because of sex. They said that by effectively enfranchising, that is allowing all men to vote, while excluding all women, the amendment would create an aristocracy of sex by giving constitutional authority to the idea that men were superior to women. Staten argued that male power and privilege was the root of society's ills, and nothing should be done to further strengthen it. For Black women, achieving suffrage was a way to counter the disenfranchisement of the men of their race. Despite this discouragement, Black suffragettes continued to insist on their equal political rights. Starting in the 1890s, African American women began to assert their political rights aggressively from within their own clubs and suffrage societies. If white American women, with all their natural and acquired advantages, need the ballot, they argued, how much more do Black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of a vote to help secure their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? The beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, brought a rising feminist activism and awareness of the strength of women. In 1911, Mother's Day became a national holiday, but that was a bittersweet victory. President Wilson supported this declaration of Mother's Day only as a way to appease the women, since he was against women's suffrage and did not support the right of women to vote. The First World War from 1914 to 1917 had changed the popular mood, and more people supported the passage of laws that allowed women to vote. At the time, British Prime Minister Hume opined that the women's contribution to the war effort challenged the notion of women's physical and mental inferiority and made it more difficult to maintain that women were, by constitution and temperament, unfit to vote. He argued that if women could work in munitions factories, it seemed both ungrateful and illogical to deny them a place in the voting booth. But the vote was much more than simply a reward for war work. The point was that women's participation in the war helped to dispel the fears that surrounded women's entry into the public arena. During the beginning of the 20th century, as women's suffrage faced several important United States federal votes, a portion of the suffrage movement, known as the National Women's Party, led by suffragette Alice Paul, became the very first cause ever to picket outside the White House. She and Lucy Burns led a series of protests against the Wilson administration in Washington. Wilson ignored these protests for 6 months, but in June 1917, just as a Russian delegation drove up to the White House, suffragettes unfurled a banner which stated, "We women of America tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent to their national enfranchisement." Another banner referring to Kaiser Wilson compared the plight of the German people with the American women. With this manner of protest, which certainly embarrassed President Wilson, the women were subject to arrest and many were jailed. Another ongoing tactic of the National Women's Party was watch fires, which involved burning copies of President Wilson's speeches, often outside the White House or in nearby Lafayette Park. The party continued to hold watch fires even as the war began, drawing criticism from the public and even other suffrage groups for being unpatriotic. In October of 1917, Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months in prison, and she began a hunger strike. After years of opposition, finally, Wilson changed his position in 1918 to advocate women's suffrage as a war measure, and the bill allowing the right of women to vote was passed by Congress and signed by Wilson in 1920, 100 years ago. And that is what we celebrate this Law Day, the 100th anniversary of the right of women to vote throughout the United States. Voting rights for women were introduced into international law by the United Nations Human Rights Commission after World War II, whose elected chair was Eleanor Roosevelt, the activist and the wife of President Franklin Roosevelt, who led us through the Great Depression and World War II, who had died in the White House in 1945 at the end of the war, as the end of the war in Europe approached. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the United Nations General Assembly thereafter adopted the Convention on Political Rights of Women in 1954, enshrining the equal rights of women to vote, hold office, and access public services as set out in national laws. One of the most recent jurisdictions to acknowledge women's full right to vote was Bhutan in 2008 in its very first national elections. Most recently in 2011, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia let women vote in the 2015 local elections, and the struggles continue today in other countries. Before 1965, women and men of color, such as African Americans and Native Americans, were disenfranchised, that is, stopped from voting, even though they had the right to vote, due to literacy laws and special voting poll taxes. And their attempts to exercise their constitutional right to vote often resulted in violence, especially in the South, where there are still voting problems that exist today. Finally, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed by our Congress, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting and which secured voting rights for racial minorities and therefore for all men as well as all women throughout the United States. I thank you very much today for your attention to our Law Day presentation. And I welcome you back to the courthouse next year, hopefully, where we can invite you to celebrate Law Day with us again.
Wow, thank you, Judge Panepinto. I think that to provide students with that much information so they can realize the importance of voting is so vital, especially in today's society. Um, Voting gives people the right to speak their mind and be represented. And when you see how many people fought for that right, it's important that we, at the very least, exercise it. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
Okay, hold on one second.
I think Irene has a surprise for you now. She has some questions she wants to ask me to interview me.
I do. I'm going to, hold on one second.